There are lots of things that government can consider that will help increase private sector productivity, right? Whether it's looking at tax policy, we're trying to find a more efficient way of collecting taxes that's hopefully tax neutral, whether it's looking at the regulatory environment, whether it's looking at increased federal investment. All those things are things that can impact private sector productivity. And that's really an important part of the recipe. One of the real difficulties anybody has right now in being too specific, we don't understand productivity growth very well. And we don't understand policies, how they impact productivity growth very well. So it's very hard for almost anybody to have too many solid recommendations on how to achieve higher productivity because we just don't know that much about it.
I appreciate that. Would you say that preparing folks for these jobs, though, has to be a component of it?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
The other line of questioning I have is slightly different, and that is on Social Security. And without taking a particular view, if we were to scrap the cap, how much revenue would that raise, and how much would that go towards solving some of the structural deficits?
It would certainly have an impact. I don't have the number in my head, but we actually did that calculation, and that options for reducing the deficit volume that we just produced, that was one of the little options that we put in there. If you look at that, and we can follow up too, give you some idea of how much of an impact that would have.
I'd appreciate that. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. We appreciate that balance of time. Thank you. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate the thoughtful comments from my colleague from New York and from California. And we do see things differently. And I want to bore down, though, on what my other colleague from California, Mr. McClintock, was getting at. In the danger of a sovereign debt crisis, I think it's much more real than people realize. And I think it's much closer than people realize. So you yourself have identified the debt as unsustainable, that we're on a path that we cannot possibly continue. And I think the numbers are compelling on that case. But what I'd like to flesh out is how this may be a nearer term event that would have cataclysmic consequences with regard to the value of our currency, with regard to future inflation, with regard to the American standard of living. I think it's interesting. I saw a McKinsey report the other day, and what it showed was we're at about 250% debt to GDP globally. And in the wake of 2008, what we saw was roughly a $57 trillion increase in debt, which was highly unusual, because what the report showed was that going back really over the last 50 plus years, actually, no, it was more than that, it went back to 1930, that in the wake of financial crisis or economic slowdown, that historically there was a deleveraging that followed. But that in this instance, post-2008, what we've seen is a reverse, a significant leveraging in the wake of financial crisis. And that therefore we lived in a time like no other, and you could see the same numbers at the federal level. You know, our debt to GDP numbers are at I guess a post-World War II high, and they're at a peacetime high. And so I was looking at numbers the other day, and I think this is a really interesting chart that again suggests how vulnerable we are and how a crisis could come much sooner than people realize. This is from the Fed, and its net worth as a percentage of disposable income. You could also do net worth as a percentage of GDP. But basically what it shows is over the last 75 years, we've been really fairly constant at an average of around 500% net worth to disposable income. But that in the early, I guess late 90s, we had a peak. It represented the tech bubble. We went above 600%, and we did it again in the housing crisis, or just pre-housing crisis, went above 600%, and we've done it again now. And what's interesting is what followed the tech bubble we know, and what followed the housing bubble we know, but we're at that same percentage in an overall inflated environment with regard to debt, both domestically and internationally. Is there a much greater level of vulnerability than we realize? And let me add one other thought to that. I pulled the numbers on economic expansions. We are now living in the fourth longest economic expansion in American history. So we had the tech bubble, We had the Reagan expansion. We had the Kennedy-Johnson expansions. But, you know, the average is 60 months. We're about a third past that, which would suggest to me another layer of vulnerability. And finally, we live in a zero interest rate policy, which is a policy that we've, in essence, never lived in. You know, I guess it was Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary that at the time of the Depression talked about pushing on a string, how there was just no more juice in terms of making things happen. So would you flesh out in the minute and a half, I guess you have, a little bit of color with regard to, you know, while we may be unsustainable in the long run, maybe this could creep up on us much sooner than people realize?
Sure. Part of the trouble is that there just isn't research, there's no way to know of how much debt is too much.
Well, I mean, I think the law of, I mean, there's a regression to the mean for a reason. I mean, I think it's even dangerous when we talk about interest rate policy and we say, well, we're going to go back to the average. Well, that's not what has historically happened. The reason you have regression to the mean is typically you go far on the other side. So interest rates go up a bunch to give you that average. So I think that the law of numbers and averages works.
Yeah, and the sort of comparison that we wind up making, and it probably should be a sobering comparison. 77% of GDP in debt is a really high number. You go up a little bit more and you have the highest debt ratio since the end of World War II. And the end of World War II was a pretty special time. So it's way above historical numbers.
Well, and that was a case wherein we were actually fighting for our survival as a republic. Right now, that money is in essence going toward consumption and, again, what many would argue to be unsustainable. Oh, we're going to have fun. Come on.
The gentleman's time has expired. I am very sorry. The ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Once again, thank you, Director Hall. I look forward to reading your new publication. I think that would be something mandatory that reading for all of us here. One thing we haven't talked about yet during this hearing is tax expenditures. And I think your report shows that tax expenditures actually are on a path, if not now, they're larger than discretionary spending in total, including defense spending, somewhere going to $1.5 trillion. Is there any difference between a dollar of tax in terms of the impact on the budget between a dollar of tax expenditure and a dollar of discretionary spending?
No, the effect on the deficits is the same.
And have you done an analysis of what types of discretionary spending maybe have a more positive or negative impact on the budget as on the deficit as you would have? So, for instance, the charitable deduction versus R&D tax credits versus mortgage deductions.
We have, none of that comes to my mind so much. Our friends, our colleagues at the Joint Committee on Taxation are the ones who've done a lot more of that work. They might have some numbers for you.
And last year, this House renewed about $800 billion of tax expenditures, as I recall, with no offsets. Isn't that correct?
I don't remember the numbers. That could be correct.
It was pretty substantial.
Yes, it was.
So when we're talking about, I hope you dealt with this in the new publication, because clearly when you're looking at over $1 trillion worth of tax expenditures, you're looking at another significant impact on the deficit, and something that we don't spend nearly enough time looking at in terms of which ones really pay off for the taxpayers. I mean, most of the mortgage deduction benefit goes to wealthier taxpayers. Isn't that correct?
I think that's probably correct. Can I just say something in general, though? I've made I referred to it, but one of the ways to sort of try to improve efficiency and productivity is to look at the efficiency of taxes, of our tax system, right? Because our tax system has lots of things that encourages behavior that causes distortions. And so there are things one could look at. You know, reducing taxes on capital investment, for example, it's a really direct way of affecting productivity, because capital investment raises productivity. Worrying about our tax base, right? There's some offshoring behavior that reduces our tax base. Some of those things especially if they're sort of tax neutral, would have an impact potentially on long-term growth without adding to the deficit.
Well, presumably, we're going to have that debate later this year, and as the House takes on tax reform, so that'll be an interesting one. This is, I know, totally out of character for me, but I'm going to ask questions that have no political point at all. Just curious about them. In your report, you project Medicare spending per beneficiary to go up 4.3% through 2027, which is 3% higher than it's been over the last 5 years. Why such a dramatic increase in projection of the cost per beneficiary?
That one's actually pretty difficult for us to forecast. Healthcare spending has been consistently growing faster than GDP, and a lot of that for us is just continuing the trend that we've seen in that. And it's actually part of our forecast that will continue to per beneficiary growth of healthcare generally will grow faster than GDP, and that actually is part of the growing deficit.
But that hasn't been the case over the last 5 years, for whatever reason.
Right.
I mean, part of it's ACA, part of it's the economy and so forth. I know there are a lot of factors involved there. But my point being, that could be totally, that could be a dramatic difference in your long-term forecast for Medicare if the growth rates per beneficiary stayed at 1/3 of what you're projecting.
Well, that's right. That could have an impact, and that you're right that the growth has slowed down. I don't know if we have it in this report, but somewhere we've got a little sensitivity analysis where we vary the cost of health care and to see what sort of impact that has on the budget deficit. We can get back to you on that, give you some idea.
Thanks. Another point you make is that the subsidies in the exchanges, assuming that they're not repealed, would double basically from this year till 10 years. And I was curious as to whether that's predicated on a doubling of the number of insureds, a rise in the premiums, so the subsidies have to keep pace with the premiums under current law. Is that the reason that they would double in 10 years, or is it a combination of both?
It's probably both, but we certainly, I think most of it is this increased use of the exchanges and increased use of the expansion, Medicaid expansion. So I think they're both in there.
Okay. So now turn to Medicaid. And so you project, this is on regular Medicaid, not the expanded Medicaid. Right. You project expenditures going from $389 billion in 2017 to $650 billion in 27, which is a significant increase. It's, I don't know what it is, 70% growth over that period of time, but it's 5.5% a year growth. Is that because you're projecting, again, rising cost per beneficiaries, or because you expect that many more people to be involved and be eligible for Medicaid, which would reflect a really bad economy? Or would it be because such a huge percentage of Medicaid is for skilled nursing, and you expect the senior population to eat up a larger chunk of the Medicaid budget?
Yeah, I have to get that level of detail. I have to get back to you. I'm pretty sure a big chunk of that is simply the increased number of people, but we can break that out for you if you like.
Okay, but would it be on the skilled nursing side? Because I mean, to say that the population eligible for Medicaid is going to grow that much over the next 5 years, again, indicates an economy that's going in the tank, which doesn't comport with the rest of your forecast.
Right. Yeah, I mean, not only we have pretty modest growth, but one of the things that we do have is a continuing trend in faster growth for income for high income folks. So the distribution of income, we have that continuing to change, and that's a trend going forward that's been there for a while. Okay. And that might be part of it.
Yeah, now going to Medicaid expansion, your projection is that between now and 27, the number of people in the expanded Medicaid would go from 12 million to 17 million people.
Right. And
that the total expense of expanded Medicaid would go from 70 billion to 142 billion. So that's a 100% increase. 7% a year is what you're projecting. Again, I'm curious as to why that's such a huge increase.
Okay, that one I know.
Okay, good.
Right now, there are 31 states and D.C. that have expanded, and that's about 50% of the eligible people. We expect that to increase, the number of states that adopt Medicaid expansion, and that will increase about 70% of the total people of all the states. So it is from growing state acceptance of that.
And, okay, it's a good answer. I wish we could see that. Policy doesn't look like it's going in that direction, however. You know, in my state, we have, I think, arguably the most successful expansion of Medicaid in the country. We reduced our uninsured by more than 60%. In my district, we're now at 3% uninsured. 81,000 people on expanded Medicaid. And the projections, if not your projections, but other projections, show that if we actually were to rescind the Affordable Care Act, the Medicaid expansion, or just the Medicaid expansion, we would lose an awful lot of jobs, tens of thousands of jobs in Kentucky. One estimate, 44,000 jobs, and $30 billion worth of economic activity over the next 5 years. Does your data, your analysis of the Affordable Care Act reflect that kind of potential loss in economic activity and employment in other areas of the country or across the country?
I'm not sure if we have that level of detail. You know, the main impact that we saw of, for example, ACA repeal is a change in the labor supply, right? And so we think that would be an increase in the labor supply that would sort of increase economic growth from repeal, and that would sort of counter some of the effects. That level of detail, I don't know offhand what we've thought about that.
Great. Well, thank you very much once again for your testimony. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Dr. Hall.
Morning.
Thanks for being here. As any other freshman here and probably other members as well, we've just come through a campaign where I know I've had many, many conversations with people throughout my district and heard concerns that they've expressed. And you know, one of the top things that we've heard is people believe that the economy is not working for them as it should. They believe, they're concerned that their kids, their grandkids, will not have the same opportunities to live the American dream that we all have had. People are very concerned about that. And they're concerned that we are asking future generations to pay the bill. And isn't it true, Dr. Hall, that it's what we're doing? If we cannot solve this problem here, we're transferring that problem to
Of the debt that we can get to you, but I think that's a concern.
So that's one concern. People are also very concerned. Their perception is that their elected leaders are not willing to make the tough decisions to solve the problems that we're faced with. And I'm hoping that we're about to change that. And I'm pleased to be on the Budget Committee to work to try to solve some of these difficult issues. And I agree with many of the other comments that have been said here today. This is not a partisan issue. These are issues that we should be looking to try to find solutions. It will take us working across the aisle to move our country in the right direction. So I'm hoping that this is the beginning of finding some of those solutions. The other thing that I've heard, and I want to get to another question to you, you know, I'm Pennsylvania, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A lot of entrepreneurs, small companies who have grown, developed in technology or whatever it may be, and created jobs, and grown into large companies that have created more and more jobs. And the business owners that I talked to today believe that it is more difficult, and I was a business owner myself, and I've seen this as well. It is more difficult. There's less incentive to invest additional capital into new technologies, to hire people, because of the environment that we've created in this economy. They believe that the regulatory environment holds them back, holds individuals, holds businesses back. and prevents that kind of economic growth that we've seen before. They believe that tax policy is no longer working for them. Do you think we are seeing that kind of impact?
I certainly think that that's a potential area for improving the long-term growth, right? Because one of the two big challenges is productivity, and things like some regulation. You need some regulation. Some regulation.
Sure.
Eliminating some regulation to actually hurt productivity, but having regulation that's unnecessary or goes too far can impact productivity. Tax policies can impact productivity.
We've talked about whether we need to tax our way out of this, whether we need to cut spending. I think we also need to look at establishing the right environment to encourage capital investment, to encourage more hiring, to encourage activities by individuals and businesses that will create that kind of economic growth. I think it's been done before, but my question to you in this regard is, how much impact will that have? Say, for instance, we are able to get to a 3% or 4% annual growth. The numbers I'm looking at look every bit as bad and worse. They don't look any better from this side of this table than they do from before. But how much impact could we have if we create an environment for much stronger economic growth?
The problem is so big, you cannot do it just with economic growth, I think. And I think one of the ways to look at that is
Can you give a sense, though, of how much difference that would make?
Well, right now we think productivity is going to grow up to about 1.3% a year by the end of our 10-year period. In the 1990s, it was as high as 2%, which is very unusual. But let's say we got another 0.5 percentage point out of productivity. We're talking about, in 10 years, we're talking about having a deficit that's about $50 billion lower. So we're talking about the deficit going from 1.4 to 0.9. Right? That's an impact, but it's not balanced, and we still have the continuing worsening of the deficit from the demographics going forward.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Madam
The
Chair.
gentleman's time has expired, and I now recognize Mr. Faso from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Hall, thank you. You raised productivity. How much would making permanent the 179 tax incentive for business investment or 100% expensing for capital expenditures, how much would that, have you factored that into or done an analysis as to how much that could improve productivity?
I don't know if we've done an analysis on that. I mean, we assume that they expire when they expire. So I'd have to see if we've done an exercise like that.
Could you get back to us on that?
Sure.
And I'm also a member of the Agriculture Committee, and I was appointed to the Nutrition Subcommittee, and I've noted that despite the general improvement in the economy in terms of employment, that we still have not seen a decline in recipients under SNAP. And I'm wondering if you've factored in and looked at that factor as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of part of our forecast. We do think there's still slack in the economy. But the underlying forecast on SNAP, I think, does incorporate our economic forecast. We think we're still about 1.5 million jobs short of full employment right now, even though the unemployment rate's very low. So that's still a significant slack left.
And I would add some of the comments of my colleagues. One of the things I heard frequently on the campaign trail and speaking to businesses was that they have jobs, they just can't find qualified people to fill the jobs. And often these rely upon, these are jobs that might have technical skills, they might need some basic mechanical skills and training in robotics, etc. I'm thinking of one particular school near my district, Hudson Valley Community College, where the guy who runs it, it's a robotic training facility. He has about 150 students in it every year. Every single student has a job. He told me that you could have literally 50 of his type centers around the country, and you still wouldn't meet the need for employment of those kind of jobs. Any comment on that?
Well, two things come to mind. Our issue with slowly growing labor force that's not growing as quickly. Part of that is our working age people just aren't entering the labor force like they have in the past. So the participation rates of working age people now are really lower than they have been in the past. And that's a puzzle, right? And we think a lot of that just doesn't look like it's coming back. So that's something that's maybe important in here. And the second thing is, one of the things that we have done a little work on is some federal investment in things like education and training. And in fact, we're coming out very shortly on a blog about what we see as the evidence on the effects of education and training that going forward that might address that issue.
Okay, I'd be interested in seeing that. I'm also interested in seeing that that publication you referenced about the 100 best ways we could use to reduce the deficit. And I think, speaking of the debt, what do you say our 10-year growth in national debt is going to be?
We're going to hit about 89% of GDP.
And in terms of actual amount of debt, it's going to go from, right now we're about 19 trillion to...
I think it's 30 trillion.
Over 10 years.
For 10 years.
And so about a 10, 11 trillion dollar increase in the debt over 10 years. Does it get a little frustrating coming up here to Congress and to tell us and the American people that their national debt is going to be $30 trillion in 10 years and no one seems to pay attention?
Well, one of the things I notice every year when we put out this report, we do a little press conference, or we talk to press and let them ask questions. And one of the questions always is, what's new about this report? And the most notable thing to me is, well, what's the most notable thing is it's still got the same punchline it did last year and the year ago. Debt is large, and it's growing, and at some points unsustainable. That's a continuing message from CBO, and it's been that message for quite a while.
Well, Dr. Hall, thank you for your service. I wouldn't recommend it, but maybe you need to set your hair on fire when you're giving that presentation. Maybe they would pay attention then. Thank you so much. I yield back, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman yields back time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Dr. Hall, thanks for joining us today. Let me turn to direct spending or mandatory spending. When I was first elected in 2010, the first phone call I got was from my nearly 80-year-old mother, and it wasn't to say congratulations. It was to say, all right, son, what are you going to do to make sure that Washington protects my Social Security benefits? Because if they don't, I'm coming to live with you. The next phone call I got was from my wife, who said, you better do what your mother said. For many years after the 1983 Social Security reforms, the Social Security Trust Fund ran fairly large surpluses. This was done deliberately to try to ensure the trust fund would have resources to pay benefits for a long time. So what is the current cash flow situation with Social Security?
Right now, their outlays exceed the revenues, even excluding interest, by a fair amount. This year, the outlays will exceed revenues by about $55 billion.
Wow. How long do you think Social Security will last at that rate?
Right now, we have our exhaustion date at 2030.
Okay. If Social Security continues to pay out more in benefits than it collects in taxes, what, in your opinion, will that mean for current beneficiaries if we don't take any action here? And I can guess at what that is. I can kind of put the two and two of what you just said together, but I'd like to hear it from you on the record. Well,
actually, our assumptions in this is that beneficiaries will still continue to get what they're promised. So even though, unless Congress acts, beneficiaries won't get their full outlays. We assume that happens. If they didn't, in 2030, benefits would just have to be reduced by about 29% right away.
All right. So is it true the longer Congress waits to reform Social Security, the harder it is to implement the reforms without affecting current retirees?
It is.
Okay. Let me go back and talk a little bit about economic growth. You know, in a 2015 study on repealing the Affordable Care Act, the Congressional Budget Office determined that repeal would increase GDP by about 0.7% on average over the medium term. That's 2021 through 2025, mostly by repealing the provisions that are expected to reduce the supply of labor in the economy. So how would repealing the Affordable Care Act affect the expected supply of labor in the economy? Would it lead to an overall benefit for the economy in your view?
Repealing it would likely increase the supply of labor in the economy. Not quite 1 percentage point. It actually would give a boost to GDP growth because of that increase in labor supply. Of our latest estimate was about 0.7% on GDP.
Okay, so if we were to repeal, it would increase the GDP by 0.7, and the expected supply of labor. Tell me again what you think that would go to.
Sure. We think that the number of people who would increase their hours or increase or re-enter the labor force, that would increase by 0.8 to 0.9% of the labor force would be.
Okay.
That would be the boost to the labor force.
I'm asking you to do some mental math here. I know that, but at the current labor rate that we're experiencing, you got any idea how many millions of people that would be back in the labor force?
Right. I don't offhand. I don't want to guess.
Can you take that as a question, please?
We can do that pretty quickly. Somebody just needs to look it up for me.
Yeah, I need a calculator too. I'm sorry. So, hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate you answering my questions, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I do want to reference the report that did come from CBO, budgetary and economic effects of repealing the Affordable Care Act. And I will read a line from this in addition to the questioning by the gentleman from Ohio. And the paragraph begins with the macroeconomic feedback effects of repealing the ACA would lower the federal deficits by $216 billion on the period from 2016 to 2025. So it would have a significant economic effect in lowering. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Hall, thank you for coming today. I guess one of the joys of being a freshman and going late in this game is I've gotten to hear a lot of these comments and have learned an awful lot. So a couple of questions for you. First of all, do you believe that the rules set by Congress that you have to follow for scoring the budget and the policy changes, do they allow us to accurately look into the future? Just yes or no?
Well, I don't have an opinion on that. We'll do whatever you like.
I would suggest that we're $20 trillion in debt. I'll let the answer stand for itself there. Next, can you accurately talk about how the proposed reforms, tax reform policy, the rolling back of the regulatory cost, possible trade policy changes, spending in defense, infrastructure, and poverty initiatives simultaneously affect the budget?
No, we'd have to see a lot more specifics and do a lot more work.
It just seems, it's awfully tough for us to have an honest conversation if we don't accurately know where we're going with these numbers and how they're actually going to affect us. Do you think that we should be using more dynamic scoring models based in predictive analytics to give your office and those around you more tools to accurately reflect what the policy changes are going to suggest?
Well, I think the policy right now is working well. The dynamic scoring, we believe, makes for a more accurate forecast. And it really makes a difference on large pieces of legislation, and that's when we're required to use it. So that seems appropriate. We're going to continue to get better at it, quicker at it, but I think it does probably help improve the accuracy.
As we sit around and we talk about this, the big challenge that we've got, obviously, is the mandatory spending. And I think that we are going to have to be honest with ourselves and the American people about the promises that have been made and our ability to continue to keep those promises. We're going to have tough decisions to make, and it's, I kind of look at it when we talk about where we are in the budget process. Are we going to have a budget that balances in 10 years? Are we going to have one that balances in 5 years? Is it going to be one that balances in 12 years? Are we not going to vote for a balanced budget because it ruins the political purity of a particular representative? I just get the sense, until we're willing to fundamentally address and honestly address the mandatory spending crisis, that we're not doing anything more than rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I want to be fair and say that there are a lot of ways you can address it. You don't have to just focus on mandatories, but the broader way that you address
Dr.
it,
Hall, you said earlier, I think the question, and I may be paraphrasing, that all of the spending, the mandatory spending, is going to outstrip all of the discretionary spending.
That's right, and the spending is mandatory. That's right.
So, I mean, it's coming at some point.
Right.
That's going to eat up every single resource that we've got, so we have to address that. The other thing, and I'll close with this. It's interesting. I kind of feel like we're a political version of Thelma and Louise right now. We've been in this here, and we've been talking about who's been the better driver for the last 50 miles. Okay. And now we're fussing about who's driving, and the car's about to go over the cliff. And it doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong if we don't stop that car from going over the cliff. The American people expect us to stop this car from going over the cliff, and I think it's going to be a real challenge that we have as a Congress and as an American people to have those very honest conversations that we've got to have. We've got to get better at scoring the budget. I believe we've got to get better at scoring the proposed changes. I think we've got to be able to strip the emotion and the politics out of our decision and use better analytics to make these tough decisions. And with that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grotham, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to take up again a little bit looking into why the economy is doing so poorly. This 1.6% growth is kind of pathetic with all the new technology that's out there. Labor participation rate is 62.7%. And I want to talk a little bit more about these entitlements, because in the last decade, means tested spending has gone up from about 670 billion to 740 billion. So more than doubled. When you look at so many of these programs, it's like they were designed by politicians who intentionally either wanted to keep people out of the labor force or not making a lot of money. And I want you to comment a little bit on whether, say, if we did something about low-income housing, where we kind of give people almost free housing as long as you don't work, or the earned income tax credit, where we punish people if they make more than $19,000 a year. Do you think we could begin to lift these numbers up, lift up the GDP, as well as lift up our tax collections, if we would get rid of some of these programs and free people from the incentives not to work? I mean, in my district, my employers, again and again, I feel, Glenn, it's tough competition out there to find workers, and the toughest competition I'm getting is from the federal government that is paying people not to work for me. Could you comment on what would happen if we'd scale back some of these programs?
Well, sure. Obviously, we need some specifics to actually do a real score and do it carefully. And of course, repealing some of these programs would have some other effects that you might want to consider. But we do a number of things and we make a point of pointing it out occasionally, which are implicit taxes on working. That if people work more and earn more, they lose benefits, or if they begin to work, they lose benefits. So that is part of our calculation. When we look at something, we look and see what impact it has on the supply of labor, willingness of people to work, and that's a consideration.
Could you easily come up with a hypothetical in which people, say if they work and make another $10,000, lose $10,000 in benefits between their Pell Grants and their Earned Income Tax Credit and their food stamps and their low-income housing?
Right. Well, I mean, those are all reasonable versions of that. For example, we've been talking a little bit about the ACA. That's part of the issue about the ACA, that decline in the labor supply is essentially an implicit tax on working where you lose your health benefits.
Right, and it's not just a decline in the labor supply. I think a lot of these programs will encourage you to work, but not very hard. You know, the earned income tax credit was clearly designed to discourage somebody from making more than $20,000 a year, right? I mean, that was what it was designed, appears what it was designed to do. There are various different cliffs in the Affordable Care Act. That was in a different hearing yesterday, in which the accountant talked about people holding down their income to get the subsidy. So in other words, the Affordable Care Act was, again, designed by somebody who wanted to discourage Americans from working hard, correct?
Well, I don't know that was a reason for it, but certainly looking at the possible side effects of programs, that what effects they may have on incentives is an important part of any public policy analysis, I think.
You think we could do both a great step towards reducing things on the spending side and getting a big increase on income collection if we pared back some of these programs and allowed people to work? When, you know, you run into people back in the district who have stories. Sometimes you don't talk to these people, but you talk to their parents, you talk to their siblings, and they'll tell you, you know, my brother, my sister, my daughter, they're not working because of the benefits. Do you think we could make a big step towards balancing the budget if we pared some of these things back?
It would undoubtedly have an impact. I don't know that it would get us towards balancing the budget because this is such a big problem, but that could have some significant impact if one looked at some of the programs and worried about the incentives.
Well, means-tested spending, according to what I have here, went up about $370 billion over the last 10 years. I mean, that by itself would be almost halfway towards balancing our budget. And you turn around and look at the huge degree in which we discourage people from working, and all of a sudden you get that income tax coming in. I suppose you'd just be afraid to take a ballpark estimate on what would happen if...
Well, that's right, and there's an element, too, of a one-time change, and then part of what we're looking for is the more permanent change, what happens to not just the labor supply, but the growth of the labor supply going forward.
Well, thanks for coming over here. It's enjoyable listening to you.
The gentleman's time has expired. As we conclude today, I just want to clip off a few things to help us recognize what a situation we are in this country right now and how desperate we are to change the current trajectory that we're on. And so let me just clip off a few reminders. Real GDP grew only by 1.6% last year, a 5-year low and half the long-term average growth rate in this U.S. Since the recession ended in 2009, the economy has grown by an average of 2.1%, making this the weakest economic recovery of the modern era. The headline on unemployment rate has declined sharply in the recent years and currently stands at 4.7%. That all sounds good. But the other aspects of the labor market remain weak. The broader unemployment rate, which includes those working part-time because they can't find full-time work, and discouraged workers who have stopped looking for work, is 9.2%, nearly double the headline rate. The labor workforce participation rate, which I continue to remind people in my district as they hear the low rate that is on the unemployment rate, that really is the rate that matters. 62.7%. That means of able-bodied workers, only 62% of them are actually employed in a full-time employment. Close to a 40-year low, and CBO expects this rate to continue to decline in the future. CBO maintains that the Affordable Care Act is contributing to this decline by reducing the overall labor supply in the economy. The average hourly earnings have increased by about 2.5% over the latest year, but that is well below the pre-recession level when earnings were growing by about 4% a year. Real median household income is finally on its upswing, but at $56,500 is still $900 or 1.6% below its pre-recession peak in 2007. So as we can see by all of these statistics and these numbers, this is affecting our economy, and more importantly, this is affecting the people of this country. So thank you, Mr. Hall, for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and answers will be made part of the formal hearing. Any members who wish to submit questions or any extraneous materials for the record may do so within 7 days.
Madam Chairman, can I make just a brief comment in response to
Nice.
your comments?
Absolutely.
In listening to both sides and to Director Hall during this hearing, we heard very few ideas for stimulating growth in the economy or specifics about what we would cut or how we would fix some of the mandatory spending programs. So I think if it would be possible maybe to have another session sometime in the next few months to discuss the actual recommendations that are in the new publication from Director Hall, and then maybe get some other people in here who can talk about how we can actually grow the economy. Because I'm not exactly sure we know how to do that, either side of us.
Point well taken,
Thank you.
Mr. Yarmouth. With that, the committee stands adjourned.